A lot of his actions on Greenland are fueled not really by security concerns or the waters around Greenland or minerals or any of the things we're thinking, but really about bitterness and personal ambition. And this is the clearest sign yet of Trump's desire for the Nobel Peace Prize perverting the course of US foreign policy.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to the Trump Report. Today, I'm joined by Bethany Elliott, journalist and commentator. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Hi, Jo. Thank you so much for having me back.
On Saturday, President Trump announced that he would impose a 10% tariff on the UK, Denmark, and 6 other European countries by the 1st of February, as he doubles down on his threats to take over Greenland. Bethany, what responses have we been hearing from these countries about this news?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had a very strong rhetorical response from Europe, which is kind of surprising when you think about people like the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte really placing themselves as friends of Trump. But there's been a very strong response. I think because, first of all, this is a humiliation for Europe. It shows that the strategy of flattery and appeasement has failed, hasn't brought Trump on board. And Trump issued these threats so publicly on Truth Social on a weekend, and there was zero respect for the continent in his post. So we've had this very strong rhetorical response from Europe. The French President Emmanuel Macron called it unacceptable. Giorgia Meloni said it was a mistake. There was criticism from all of the major British political parties, even by the Reform UK leader Nigel Farage, who's a friend of Trump's. And the European Parliament is ready to block the ratification of the EU-US trade agreement signed last July. There have been calls for the EU to use its anti-coercion instrument against the US. It was originally conceived as a response to Chinese economic coercion, but it would allow the EU to impose sweeping restrictions on US goods and services, suspend investment, or intellectual property protections, and Macron is urging the EU to do so. In terms of the UK, the Institute for Public Policy Research said that 25,000 jobs could be threatened across the British automotive sector. So the business secretary here, Peter Kyle, has been having very urgent meetings with car and steel manufacturers who might be worst affected. And Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, gave an urgent speech this morning in which he said that this was wrong, which is quite strong language from Starmer towards Trump. And it really interferes with Starmer's strategy. He's trying to focus on the cost of living at the moment. He's trying to focus on economic growth. And Trump is not only stealing the narrative, but damaging Starmer's goals.
And I want to focus on that relationship between the US and the UK, because in the past, you could maybe say that Starmer's strategy has been to appease Trump, to sometimes turn a blind eye to his actions. But what we're hearing at the moment is Starmer coming out and saying that the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. But we're also hearing Starmer saying that he doesn't believe Trump will use military action in Greenland, and also that in terms of potential UK retaliatory tariffs, he said that a tariff war is in nobody's interest, which suggests that he's potentially ruling that option out. How do you expect Starmer to respond to the US about these potential tariffs? What method can he use there?
I thought it was very interesting this morning at his press conference that Starmer talked about national interests. And I think we're now seeing he's in a position where he's forced to defend his country versus the relationship with Trump. So, of course, he has to go with national interests. And that is an attitude that's been taken across Europe and within the UK as well. We have seen that there's been a spate of news stories indicating a very significant degree of US interference in British affairs of late. It's recently emerged that when she was Housing Secretary, Angela Rayner delayed decisions on plans for a new Chinese embassy in London, following US concerns about secret rooms and the risk of spying. The US has suspended the bilateral tech prosperity deal, even though the signing of that was at the centre of the state visit that Trump so eagerly wanted last year. And Politico today was saying that American trade negotiators are pushing for the UK to adopt American standards, even though that would damage the UK's relationship with the EU, and they want recognition of US accreditation bodies in the UK. And then Trump lawyer Robert Garson told the Daily Telegraph that he's spoken with the US State Department about the US giving refuge to British Jewish people who wish to leave due to anti-Semitism. He said the UK is no longer a safe place, and he criticised Keir Starmer personally and claimed he'd allowed rampant anti-Semitism to become commonplace in society. So even if that proposal is kindly meant, it's causing great difficulty for the UK Prime Minister on what has been a very sensitive issue for him. And so I think in terms of strategy, Starmer not wanting to have a trade war is different from the EU. We know that Macron's quite keen on the use of this anti-coercion instrument. There's a lot of talk within the EU about how to use sanctions. So already the UK is a bit isolated from the EU in terms of responding to this threat over Greenland and threat over tariffs. We've seen that Starmer does call out Trump when they disagree. Trump had criticised last year publicly Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, and Starmer did stand up and say he's a friend of mine. So he can do that. I think Starmer, based upon his prior strategy with Trump, is probably going to try and speak to him this week in Davos, where there's a gathering of world leaders, and try to talk to him and talk him out of it. I think that tends to be the strategy.
And what did you make of that message that President Trump sent to the Norwegian Prime Minister, in which he said over the weekend that he no longer feels obliged to think purely of peace due to not getting the Nobel Peace Prize? What are your thoughts about that? And also, I mean, how much does this go to being just bold language rather than does he actually genuinely mean it?
I think it shows how emotional Trump is. He said, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. It shows how he thinks in very transactional terms, which we know already, but his idea is you only focus on peace if there's a prize in it for you. And he said the world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. So it shows how a lot of his actions on Greenland are fueled not really by security concerns or the waters around Greenland or minerals or any of the things we're thinking, but really about bitterness and personal ambition. And this is the clearest sign yet of Trump's desire for the Nobel Peace Prize perverting the course of US foreign policy. He's always pitched himself as a president of peace, saying he could end the Ukraine war in a day. But last year there was a rift between him and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, after Trump mistakenly thought that India would join Pakistan in nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And at one stage, Modi was reportedly not even taking Trump's calls. The Nobel Committee has had to say that prizes once given cannot be revoked or transferred. And of course, we saw last week that the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, gave her Nobel Peace Prize to Trump, and he was delighted to receive something that wasn't his and he hadn't earned. So I think we're seeing that the bitterness and the personal ambition of the Nobel Peace Prize is having a real impact on US foreign policy.
What are his objectives with Greenland? If, for example, if he's saying this about the Nobel Peace Prize and his what appears to be his upset at not being nominated for it, but then, for example, these threats that he's making to Greenland, it seems to be sort of a self-imposing problem, isn't it?
I mean, Greenland is important due to global warming, ice is melting, and so waters become navigable. China would like to use those for merchant vessels, and we're talking about China and Russia being able to reach the North Atlantic faster. Trump has claimed that there are Russian destroyers and submarines and Chinese submarines all over the place. And he said we're not going to have Russia or China occupy Greenland, even though the Danes have been saying that there hasn't been a Chinese warship there for over a decade. And I think in terms of the strategy here, it is typical Trump. There's an obsession with gratitude from European nations in that Truth Social post and them not paying their way in his eyes. There is this obsession with tariffs, a belief in not sovereignty, but treating territory like real estate. And I also wonder if this could be a distraction technique from Ukraine. Trump is making very little progress on Ukraine. He recently blamed Zelensky and said that he was the problem, even though Zelensky's been doing everything he can to negotiate, even offering to potentially let what is currently Ukrainian-held territory become a free economic zone. And Putin has been the one who's been trying to push forward on the battlefield and heavily attacking Ukraine's infrastructure. We know that Trump isn't happy when Putin humiliates him in this way by conducting heavy strikes on Ukraine. And that's exactly what's happening at the moment. So it might be that he wants to take the media focus away from Ukraine onto Greenland.
I want to turn to the other news of today, which is that it's being reported that the Kremlin are saying that Vladimir Putin has received an invitation to join what's believed to be the Gaza Board of Peace. Why do you think that Putin was invited?
Well, going into the background of the Gaza Board of Peace, it's an umbrella oversight body for Gaza, and the idea is that Trump would chair it. It would mostly be made up of heads of state from around the world. It would be chaired for life by Trump and would start by addressing the Gaza conflict and then be expanded to other wars. Underneath that, there would be a Gaza Executive Board responsible for overseeing the on-the-ground work of another administrative group, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. So the White House has been announcing these members, but it is causing controversy already, even before Putin was invited. There are no Palestinians on either of the senior boards, only on the lowest level to manage specific sectors like justice or education. The only Israeli on the Gaza Executive Board is a businessman called Yakir Gabay, and Netanyahu's office said yesterday that the formation was not coordinated with Israel, so already Trump is imposing his will. The Executive Board will include officials from Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, the UAE, even though Netanyahu yesterday expressed opposition to Turkey and Qatar being there, claiming they'd been supporting and funding Hamas. And then it's caused controversy within Israel because the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, called for a return to full war. And so there have been reports of British, Hungarian, Jordan, Turkish, Indian, Egyptian, and Argentinian leaders being invited to join, but there's been a lot of caution in responding. The Kazakhstan president, Kasim Jomart Tokayev, has said he would join. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, said he would join, and now Putin has been invited. Firstly, we know that Putin is always desperate to be considered an equal to Trump and for Russia to be treated as another superpower. So he will, on a personal level, be thrilled to be given this position, as he will consider it a mark of his status. Secondly, it has long been a hallmark of Russian and Soviet foreign policy in the Middle East that the Kremlin desperately wants to be involved in all discussions and wants to be a mediator. We saw that last week. The Kremlin announced that Putin had had calls with the Israeli and Iranian leaders and said Russia was ready to mediate. It is, again, partly a question of prestige and status, yet the Russians really leveraged that power. Back in early 2016, there was an inquiry here in the UK into the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko, and it found that Putin had probably, as they said, approved the murder. And the then Prime Minister David Cameron said that the UK had to continue engaging with Russia due to Moscow being what he termed a player in Syria. So Putin really loves being at the centre of dealings in the region, so we can expect him to take this role and then leverage it for practical gain and to force other countries to engage with Moscow, no matter what bad behaviour it engages in. And also, I think Putin's involvement is going to put Western leaders off from engaging. Starmer today in his press conference said we are open to participating constructively in such efforts regarding the Middle East. However, he didn't fully endorse the idea, and there are reports that even before Putin's inclusion, he was concerned about the terms and also the associated fee.
Are we hearing any response at the moment from, especially from like the US's allies, for example, about this potential invitation to Putin?
Nothing yet, but again, I think it shows Trump's character in that, again, he is weirdly susceptible to Putin. He does seem to think they have this personal engagement. And also it shows how transactional he is, how obsessed he is with money, because the FT reported that countries that join will serve a limited 3-year term unless they contribute over $1 billion within the first year of operations, and then it's a permanent seat. So will this be a useful instrument? Probably not, because Putin will want to join and that will put off other countries, so it will become very politicized. And also it's already causing tensions in terms of not giving sufficient representation to Israelis or Palestinians. And also, does Trump actually want this to work for the sake of Gaza, or is this just an alternative to the UN? I think that's another important question, because a copy of this has been circulating with the charter for the organizations, and the broad mandate means it could be used as a rival to the UN, because US officials have been talking about using it as for Ukraine or Venezuela. The idea is that Trump would have very strong powers as the chair of the Board of Peace. He could remove members or appoint them, and his decisions could only be overturned by 2/3 of members. He'd have a veto on decisions. He could create other subsidiary entities. And we know he's had a very difficult relationship with the UN. In his first address to the General Assembly since his re-election, he said it had been ineffective with his own attempts to broker peace. And the very broad mandate of this, and the idea that it's not just for Gaza, but potentially other conflicts in the future, suggests that Trump is not really doing this for the sake of Israel or Palestine, but to create an alternative to the UN.
Do you think that it's fair to assume that, for example, the allies to the US that Trump is potentially threatening these tariffs to over Greenland, they might not be best pleased about this news either?
100%. I think we're seeing very strong tensions between the US and Europe, not only over Greenland and this very public tariff threats, but also the inclusion of Putin. And it shows that the strategy of trying to show Trump from the Europeans who Putin really are has failed completely.
Well, Bethany, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much for having me.